Welcome back to another CommCon Virtual 2020 session. This time we're with Varun from CallStats and 8x8. 8x8 are sponsoring. They're one of our silver sponsors. So thank you for sponsoring and trusting us with imparting all of this knowledge. So Varun's going to talk to us about shelter in place and how that has affected media quality and other things. I'm going to hand it over to Varun straight away, and then I'll catch up with Varun and you afterwards. Thanks, Varun.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks, CommCon, for inviting us in. And I'm really glad that we're able to do this in these extraordinary circumstances. I also thank our team, Nate, who did all the hard work, and I get to present on behalf of him, and Manu Mukherjee, who's the Senior Director for AI and ML at 8x8. And you well know about me, so I'll just speak a little bit about who we are, how we got here. So CallStats has been around since 2013, 2014. We were a bootstrap startup. We then raised some venture funding, and in early 2020, Jan 2020, we were acquired by 8x8. And it's exciting times. This is just before the pandemic broke. And the history with 8x8 has been that CallStats been used by their products extensively internally. And people in product support, deployment, professional services use CallStats to deliver the 8x8 product. Now it's part of the CPaaS offering. So there's new 8x8 voice and video CPaaSs available that were launched a month and a half ago. CallStats is part of that. We continue to support our existing client base. So from Amazon Connect, Video Flex, Voice Video, Vonage, Nexmo, TalkBox. We continue to do that, and it's part of the bundling on 8x8. So for example, if you're using any of our products, Meetings Pro, X Series, similar, you as an end user can get access to CallStats as part of the analytics offering for those platforms. And I think this is really compelling for CallStats now. Not only is it being used extensively by 8x8 internally, but also at outfacing with our customers and our old client base, or customer base with Amazon and Twilio. So this is super exciting times for 8x8 and CallStats. So just jump right into it, why we're doing this. So basically, at the beginning of January, COVID-19 broke first in East Asia and then out as global travel came to a halt. At some point, lockdowns were initiated in each country. And when we went into February, March, April was super hectic for us at CallStats as well. We were scaling crazy. Like once we had all that scaling figured out and we kind of saw the light at the end of the tunnel, we basically looked at each other and said like, hey, what about like reinitiating our WebRTC metrics report, so you can see our metric reports from 2016 all the way till 2019. So this will come out next week with when the video is out. You're going to see this a report come out. And when we looked at the first 4 months, we noticed that as the pandemic grew, the internet call quality kind of deteriorated. And if you look at it visually, globally, across, you don't see much trends because like the lockdowns happened at various points. The usage kind of changed dramatically already in February. But like if you look at specific geographies and if you play back what happened in those periods of time, and look at the data, you're able to tell a better story than like looking at globally. So for this talk, especially now, we're looking at North America. And the reason we're looking at North America is basically because USA, Canada, Mexico, they kind of went into lockdown in the same kind of time period. The way they went into lockdown is also familiar. We know what happened. It's very well documented. And a lot of the products that people use for real-time communications are based in the US. So like 8x8's offered from there. You have Google, Zoom, and others. So you can also see like there's a story to be told on how this adoption changed. For us, basically, for this analysis, we're just looking at North America. We're only looking at calls originating and terminating in this region. Uh, the other thing that we did was we removed all the call center traffic, so G711s and single person traffic, they're all removed. So this is all about audio is Opus, for video is VPX, VP8 and 9. It's either CPaaS offering from 8x8 or someone else, or it's a self-hosted, so someone running their own infrastructure. And one of the things that we did was, because we want to benchmark the whole period, no new customers that joined us during, like in in March or in April, are part of that analysis. So basically, this is uh, all the customers that already had call stats at the beginning of the year. So just to like show you how the lockdown actually happened, between mid-March and end of March, various states within the United States went into some form of shelter in place. You can read more at the New York Times article, but basically you can see that the West Coast goes lockdown dramatically immediately on 23rd, and by the 30th, literally the two coasts are in lockdown, and major part of the country. So we'll start with two parts of this. So we're going to do like overall North America, and then the second part of the analysis is basically just the coast of the United States of America. And for our analysis, we broke down the periods into four parts. So there is Jan Feb, that's one part. Then March separately, and then April. In April, as you can see before from the chart here, that everyone is in like kind of lockdown status as of first of April. So we know that to be the place where shelter in place was widely adopted in North America. But the month of March is like a period of transition. So in the early part of March, like the first week, in the second week of March, we see that a lot of companies, especially in the Bay Area, companies go into trialing work from home. So not all their employees, but majority part of their employees are working from home. Some of them come to work, but and this is mainly done to stress test the infrastructure, VPNs and such, and that if the company is not really been doing work from home for majority of their employees, that they're in a good place to trial it. And by the middle of the month, when the shelter in place orders actually come in, these employees are either transitioning, or in general, people using the services are transitioning to shelter in place, which means that we did not actually think that the second and the third phases would be distinct. But in our data, when we look at it, and we look at the behavior of the data or the usage pattern, we can see these four stages, especially in terms of usage. So I'll just skip directly into this. And we know that impact of media usage, things that has been talked widely as part of like working from home, shelter in place, in most teams, is doing video calls, so that there's a video etiquette in place. People want to see you. People want to like create a social connection with people that they're working with. And one of the things that we can easily see from this is that video etiquette actually emerges as part of this. So for example, in phase one, which is January, February, we can see that the basically audio is dominant. There are some people doing video, and as we do trialing work from home, people like kind of try that etiquette out. Then as you go into phase three, which is like actually moving to shelter in place, and I think just from our own observations at 8x8 and how the company did, we noticed even in our behavior, like during that period when people were transitioning to shelter in place, we went back to doing audio calls, a lot more audio calls, because people were on the move, moving desks, buying stuff, to make sure that they had their and they had all the amenities for them during this period. And as we go into April, we can see that the video etiquette kind of comes into play completely, like with a lot more calls doing video. So we went from like about 15% to about 50% doing audio and video simultaneously. And we also see the decline sharply in audio. We also noticed that a lot of people actually connect to a call via various devices. So the participation is also higher. So some people, dial in from their mobile to do the audio call, and if they need to do a screen share or look at a screen share, then they join the call later with video. So there's a lot of like parables that you can draw depending on what type of use case people are doing. And in this case, this that we have is not just 8x8, but also like all our customers that use call stats. So this can be telemedicine, healthcare, education, other forms of real-time communications and collaborations. Um, not going to name names here, but get the picture. So this is the impact on media usage. Call participation, as you can see. So this is clustered by participants. So 2, 3 to 5, and 6. And here you don't actually see a subtle, you don't see much change. So you can see that most of the calls are like the 2% calls have kind of declined on ever so slightly. One of the things that you can see is the weekly, you can see the weekends here. So you have during the week, you have the 6% calls, and over the weekend, this kind of dies down, then week, then dies down, so on and so forth. And you can still see that behavior with the blue here, but with the black, which is the 2% calls, like you start to see the plateauing happening. So that means the number of calls are actually on the rise, but you no more can see the weekends. There's very little data here, but this is something that we've observed going into May and also now, that these peaks that we see, which were really on the weekends, like during the week, you have more people calls, and during the weekends, like the 2% calls emerge. That's kind of disappeared as we go into shelter in place. Duration. I mean, this was expected, right? Like we know that there are more calls. Not only there are more calls, there are also longer calls. So, like for example, during before shelter in place, so this period, you can see that you would have like these long calls right at the beginning of the week. You can see Monday, Tuesday, and then the rest of the week goes, including weekends. Then Monday, Tuesday. So you kind of see that cadence of long calls only occurring on average at the front of the week. And as you go into shelter in place here, we can see that the width of the long calls have increased. So not only is it now we can see the distinct weekend show up here. So we're definitely seeing an emergence of longer calls. Again, here you can see the shorter calls, the peaks are gone, they're kind of removed. So we do have longer calls. They're on more days now on average. And when we plot the averages, so the reason we plot this was because it tells a better story. But on average, the call duration was around the 20-25 mark here. That's average across globally, and now it's kind of jumped to about 55. So the averages are much higher as well, as expected. But this is a better story. We can easily see that the 30-minute calls are higher. Going forward, so that was all participation data. Now we're looking at network data. And one of the things I want to call out is that each chart that you see related to a metric is actually either a median or a 95 percentile metric for a call leg. So for example, if the call was for 15 minutes, we take the median value for latency or for losses or something. We'll call that out specifically in the next slides. So it's a measure. So if it's a 95 percentile metric, it shows the 5% worst value. So it's not the maximum, and it's not max -1, but it's like the 5% highest value for a particular metric. In this case of latency, we're picking the median, which is the 50%. And what we're plotting is if you took all the data, so all 100 of our calls, and plotting what you see in the gray area is the 25 percentile, which is the low number, 75 percentile, which is the high number, and the median, which is the dark number. So that gives you kind of this spread of data, and we're kind of removing all the the noise from it. So we're only looking at 25 to 75 percentile, which is called the interquartile region for these metrics. With that, I'll just jump straight into into this metric. So in this case, it's latency. So this is the round trip time between like the end users or the server, as the case may be. And what we're plotting is the interquartile. And what we notice is, the expectation is that over the weekends, the network kind of is not heavily loaded. So we kind of see this like weekly cadence. So we can see during the week,
It's 14 hours.
during the week, the latencies jump, and over the weekends or whenever the heavy load occurs, it kind of increases. So we can see that not to be the case here. So like the weekends, actually much part of the week is low latency. There's not that many peaks. That means the number of days with high latencies are fewer in January, February. And as you go into March, especially with the trial for work from home, we can see that it jumps. The ISPs and a lot of systems were not prepared to scale. A lot of that scaling happened in March and April. So we can see like the initial response was not that great. We know from fact that Netflix and YouTube and all those companies and services kind of scaled back their video quality. So this is for not for real-time systems, but mostly for things for movies and stuff, streaming basically, reducing the video quality. You can see that some of those things kind of happen in the middle of March. And as you go into April, we noticed that the averages have increased, but they're not dramatically over, and the numbers are not that great, that bad either. So basically, we went from a 50 millisecond average to about 80, 90 milliseconds. So kind of 1.5 times in numbers. So it's not yet doubled, which is great, and it's still within the ITUT recommendations of 120 or 150 or 200, depending on what type of is it audio only or video. So for video, you have much higher tolerance for latency. And we can see that this, in this case, it's well within the one-way delay is well within the range. So as we go into jitter, and this was something that we kind of expected going in, since the round trip time did not change as much, but we know for a fact that there was a lot more cross traffic, and we can see that as we go January, February, the jitter values were really low, right? Like this is median jitter for all the call legs in 25 to 75 percentile is within the 5 millisecond mark. And typically audio is at 20 milliseconds, like you generate packets every 20 milliseconds. And if they're jittering at 5 milliseconds, that's not that bad. But as you, and for video, it's 15 frames per second. So it's even like here, but we're only plotting audio jitter here. And what we notice here is Jan Feb, apart from this one spike in early Feb, there isn't like a great deal of jitter here. But as you go into trialing from work from home, there's a big spate. The ISPs, again, preparedness and scaling of services show up here as people and services and ISPs become aware of this impending issues with call quality. And of course, we know T-Mobile, Comcast released a lot more capacity and services scaled. But as we go into April, the jitter's not kind of normalized, but it's still not as bad as the initial part. So in terms of the peak that we see here, so a lot more control. People and systems have scaled dramatically, but we still see delay of over 20 milliseconds. The medians are higher. This would result in some kind of gobbling of sound and stuff. So the typical recommendations here is like if the jitter is high, you can increase packetization. Because if you don't do that, then you would have this garbled audio sounds, which means that when the jitter is high and the playback is trying to make it smooth, what's going to happen is when it gets the packets together, it's going to play them back. It'll try to play them back as smoothly as possible, but if it's not able to do that, what you'll hear is like acceleration and audio playback. So you'll hear like someone speaking really fast and then kind of slow down, which some people call it like Donald Duck, like speaking really fast and then slowing down and then speaking fast again. And some of these problems can be mitigated by using a more adaptive jitter buffer or increasing the play packetization delay from 20 milliseconds to 40 milliseconds, for example. And the reason I make that recommendation is because of packet loss. So one of the things that we're plotting here is the 95 percentile packet loss. So this is not median. This basically shows like what was the 5% highest packet loss, and you can see that this is still under 1%, right? So like it's under 2%, it's 1% this year, and except for like a particular week in the shelter in place in the end of April, we noticed that most of it is under 0.5%. So the packet loss is not all that much. The latency is low, so you can do NACking, you can retransmit the packets. There's so many. Of course, the network's not as performant as it was before, so we can see that the median was actually very low before this 95 percentile packet loss, not average. And as we go into April, the packet loss increases, and but it's still not significant. So having an adaptive playout buffer would definitely help in these cases. Having NACs also helps because the latency is low, so you can send a NAC and get a response in those cases. Opus comes with FEC or some kind of audio energy of the previous packet. So all those techniques kind of help in better playout. And last but not the least, we're talking about audio and video throughput. We can see the Jan was really, in some sense, this was what we found surprising. Like we see this kind of oscillation in audio throughput as we go into February, but in the middle of February, the systems in general, I'm assuming that Chrome or like one of the browsers push out an update where like the audio throughput was much higher, and what we see is that before even March, like the audio throughput started to like be higher than before. So we can see like this was between 20 to 40. We come here, it becomes 30 to 60. And as we head into like shelter in place, work from home, we kind of do not see much change compared to January. It's like literally the same thing. The peaks and troughs are not as high and diverse as before. So becoming and working within a band of available rates. Again, showing that the ISP is kind of scaled quite well, especially the audio was not impacted. And going on to video, so this is all of United States, Canada, and Mexico. We again do not have a spectacular story if we average out all the data from the space. So we can see that the video throughput in this case is, there's not much you can say. Like in general, you could say the video throughput was kind of trending low. Then during this period, in general, because adoption is higher, I'm assuming because the adoption picked up for video, we're seeing a lot more representation of video throughputs than we had before. So I think if you look at in this period, there was 80% audio and 20% video. And as we go into 50-50, we're kind of looking at audio being at the same level as before and video kind of ramping up to about 1 megabit per second, which is not bad, which is super good. And last one, impact on topology. And this was interesting because one of the questions that people ask is like, hey, how much is the infrastructure being used? And we know there are like more calls with more participants, which means that we expect that there to be more server usage anyway. And one of the things that we can see is P2P node turn is like kind of decreased. And I think that's mainly because of participation has increased. A lot of the P2P traffic is moved to server. And in general, of course, like of the P2P, turn has increased. So like that is kind of, both were representative. And I can see like in many cases, when you have a third participant in a call or a fourth participant or a fifth, you're going to see like more server usage. There are some people who are using server with a turn, they show up at the bottom. So these are the four cases. We kind of expected server usage to be higher, and you can see that kind of doubled here. And also the turn usage is much higher compared to before. as a function of population and usage. So I'll take a pause here and I want to talk a little bit about West and East Coast. This is interesting because when we look at the data for the whole of United States, we didn't actually see that much of a difference. Like we see the audio video change a little bit, but not much. In many cases, we know that the shelter in places happened slightly different, delayed. So we kind of took the whole of North America data, split it into the coasts. And so we're only now for this part of the presentation, only looking at West and East Coast. And we know that Washington, Oregon, California went into shelter in place much earlier. The orders came on 23rd, but like Amazon, Google, a lot of the companies in the Bay Area and LA kind of were trialing working from home much earlier, as early as 1st of March. Whereas all those recommendations were a bit lagged on the East Coast companies. So just looking at things, I think we found this exciting and interesting. When we put these call participation data together, we didn't see kind of much change apart from the fact that 6+ was being higher overall, but not by much. But here we can see that there is a clear differentiation on the East Coast, which is the chart on the right. You can see that the calls with 2-person participation kind of declined from around over 60% on most cases in January, February, about 50% in April. So there's definitely a user behavior change here. We don't kind of see that behavior here. We do see that as we went into February, this kind of increased, and as we went into trialing work from home, it stayed. And as we go into this period with transition, but as we come out into actual shelter in place, this kind of mimics what we had before in January. Again, here the calls with more participants in January, more again here they reemerge. There's a period here where we don't see much of that happen, and that's understandable, especially with transitioning to working from home. And during trialing work from home, a lot of people were doing fewer calls with large participants. So we can see that emerge. People were very conscious of time, and as we go into shelter in place, we still need to get work done and coordinate across different departments. Depending on the use case, I think especially collaborations has seen fewer calls, less often, but more participants ever so often. And again, we see these peaks of high usage participation being at the beginning of the week. So you can see Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday. So going from Monday again into Tuesday, Wednesday is something that we've seen which it's similar behavior to what we had before. But again, it's a stark comparison on how the West Coast and East Coast in participation. Then call duration. There we don't see much distinction between East and West Coast. We can see that 1st of March was a Sunday. Going into Monday, 2nd of March, we see a big change in behavior. The same here. 1st of March is here. 2nd of March, again. So the call durations kind of jumped overnight, and as we go into transition, they kind of scaled back. But again, as we go into shelter in place, this durations have increased, and what used to be earlier just one or 2 days in a week where you had these long calls show up on average spikes have again kind of flattened. So you kind of see more often longer calls throughout the week, and over the weekend we again see them scale back. So going into latency and variation, there's not much here. We can see that we kind of see the weekend or weekday spikes, which we don't see in the East Coast. We do see them on the West Coast. But as we go into shelter in place, those spikes disappear on this side, spikes disappear on here. the numbers, as I said before, there's a round trip times, one-way delay is 120 milliseconds, so 240 milliseconds is the bar, so well within all that. So the latencies haven't really increased by much. They have indeed increased a little bit. I would say 1.5 times would be my guess, going from like 50 milliseconds to about 70, 80 milliseconds here. And it's a wider, so the 25-75 percentile, the interquartile range has widened, so get a lot more values in this range compared to before. East to west, we can only see that during the trialing work from home, the impact was more on the west coast, less on the east coast. In general, like West Coast saw deterioration first and kind of reacted or like kind of tried to manage it. The East Coast did not see that kind of like sustained peak in that period. If we go into audio jitter, this is mind blowing because like on the West Coast, we see that the 75 percentile is super high. So when people were trialing from home, this kind of shows up here. That's not as bad on the East Coast, but the West Coast, the ISPs kind of really had to work hard to solve this problem, because jitter over 100 milliseconds means that we would have had a lot more issues with call quality, a lot more playback issues, freezing, like basically having to repeat sentences because the other parties did not hear what the person was saying. The jitter in general, like on the East Coast, is lower compared to West Coast. We can see like it's about 50 milliseconds delay. My recommendation before that, 40 millisecond inter packetization delay would be helpful. I think what we really need is an adaptive algorithm that would look at jitter and then go and modulate how often or the size of the audio packets it's sending, so that it can have much lower jitter. The other aspect is also the fact that we're sending video. So 50% of your traffic is video with audio. So there's a lot more video on the links. There is definitely more video compared to before. So like anything that you're doing to improve audio quality needs to be done in taking video into account, like what you're doing for video at the same period of time. But this was what we thought when we had the overall US and US North America data. We did not see the stark distinction between what we saw was the jitter was high, where we can see that the East and the West Coast are behaving slightly differently. So more regional analysis needs to be made for going forward. Therefore, like a single heuristic driven decision on the infrastructure side would not be like ideal. You need what we would recommend is adaptive algorithms. Then with the media throughput, we can see the audio throughputs here. Like there's not much to say. The audio throughput on the West Coast to East Coast, you can see like it was much lower. The East Coast was lower than the West Coast. As we go into March, things improve. We know that the averages changed overall. Both coasts are kind of tracking each other, so not that much of a difference. Video throughput, we can see that East Coast kind of rose up, so we can see that the usage of video is definitely higher. We're tracking much higher numbers compared to February and March. What we do notice here, which is something that we're still investigating, is why the West Coast video, which was much higher in bitrate from East Coast, is kind of like flips phases. So now what we see going into shelter in place is that the video on the West Coast is doing much lower bit rates compared to, so there's a 200 kilobits per second difference here. And there's not much to like. There's a lot of speculation. Maybe the products are adapting the bit rate. There might be some behavior changes. There may be more screen sharing, which tends to result in lower bit rates. Those are things that we are investigating and looking into. So going into topology. So I showed this before, P2P and server usage. So this is the West Coast, this is the East Coast. One of the things that we notice is that there's not much change between the West Coast between Jan, Feb, March, April. There is a little bit, like the server is being used a little bit more than before. The turns have slightly increased. That was kind of expected, but the major change that we see is here. And if you remember correctly, the P2P usage here has declined, but if you remember from the slides before, the participation data on the East Coast suggested that the number of calls where two participants had declined from before, and I think that is also showing the effect here. So more infrastructure usage compared to direct peer-to-peer connections. Turn, of course, has increased vastly. So these are all signs that participation has increased, calls are longer. If there are more people in a call, you need infrastructure. So in general, like we do see a need for infrastructure. We do see a need for more infrastructure, and the data shows that indeed people are using more infrastructure. So going into observations, so anecdotally, we know that streaming services reduce video quality. We know ISPs added capacity to change the rate limiting algorithms. We also know anecdotally that from our own usage, looking at other people in our neighborhood, we know that usage of video real-time communication systems has increased. Of course, a lot more video calls happening. People are using video calls with their doctors more. Education, especially like with a lot of schools being closed, a lot of this moved online. The online education industry, like we've seen a rapid growth in adoption on those. The companies that we were already monitoring, we've seen like tremendous growth there. Again, those in general suggest that video was on the rise. And we also know that from this, that what we expected from our data was January, February. Then March would have been March and April. We would have seen like kind of deterioration. But what we noticed was that trialing from work from home, so a lot of enterprises experimented with remote work, which we knew anecdotally. But when we look at it in our data, we found that surprising because we saw that behavior manifest, which we thought would be marginal at best. And going into it, we know that we had to scale a lot, not only call stats, but a lot of our customers, like the turn servers, the CPaaS offerings from the rest of the industry, they were all scaling like super fast. Every day was a different day. There was no model. Like people were growing 2x, 3x, 5x day on day. So impact was not as severe. The ISPs responded fairly quickly. We noticed that March was like the turning point. The experimentation definitely probably geared us up for April. So things in April were much better than like early March from our data in this case. And what we notice is that the issues that we're seeing with call quality, basically garbled audio and all that, there is packet loss. If latencies are low, using NACs or retransmissions helps. Having FEC, forward error correction, also helps. I think having a better jitter buffer model or an adaptive jitter buffer model, being able to change packetization timing and intervals, like those are the things that I think would definitely be lessons learned. And if we can tune them, make them more adaptive, have more fine-grained control over this, we'll be better prepared in terms of both in terms of products and services, but also in terms of CPaaS offerings and similar. And in general, I think machine learning based recommendations for networking media configuration, that's something that I think directly follows on this. We need more of that. we can't hand tune a lot of these, so some of these algorithms need to adapt based on what we've seen before. So those are my closing remarks. With this, I open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Varun. That was really, really interesting. I've got so many questions, but I'll hold off until the Q&A. The information that CoolStats has, I want to look at it all. I want to be able to go, I want to be able to look and go, oh, Google as a platform is really good for media and Amazon is less so good, or whatever the result is. I can only imagine the data you've got at your fingertips. Something I really want to know is G711 packet loss. As we know, quite a few cloud contact centers are using G711 as a default rather than, say, Opus, so that they don't have to transcode over to the PSTN. And as we know, G711 doesn't handle packet loss at all well. So those stats would be really, really interesting. But I'm not going to ask too many. I'm not going to talk about this. I want to get other people involved, get other people asking questions as well. So I'm going to say thank you very much to Varun. Thank you very much to CoolStats and 8x8. And we're going to head over to Riot, riot.commcon.xyz. The link will be in the description below for Q&A, where you'll be able to ask Varun any question you may have. Thank you very much for taking the time, and we will see you over on Riot shortly. Cheers.
Thank you.
Don't go anywhere quite yet, though. We've got to say thank you to all of our sponsors. Without them, none of this would have even happened in the first place. So for our platinum sponsors, we've got Toulouse, Voxbone, and Ciara. For our gold sponsors, we've got the Matrix Foundation, Vonage, Sangoma, Telviva, and Loway. Our silver sponsors are Aptosay, Pion, Telco Bridges with ProSBC, Avoxy, 8x8 with Jitsi, and FirstCom Europe. And we've also got community sponsors, QXIP and Cycol Systems. Without any of them, this would never have even happened. You wouldn't have had all of this free content on YouTube. So go say thank you to all of them. Go look at what they provide, what services they offer, and have a conversation with them all over on Riot, riot.commcon.xyz. The link will be in the description below, along with links to all of our sponsors. You can go and watch preview videos from all of our gold sponsors right now over on YouTube. The links will be somewhere over here. All I've got to say is thank you to all of our sponsors, and I'll see you over on the Q&A shortly. Cheers.